Dr. Steven Everts, Director of the EU Institute for Security Studies, will join us today in ELIAMEP's podcast series. Dr. Everts, thank you so much for having this discussion for ELIAMEP podcast series. And at this really crucial time, I believe, for Europe, for the European Union. Europe is amid two wars, Ukraine and the Middle East, and holds its breath because US elections are coming and no one can really predict the result. So what must Europe do to be ready for the challenges ahead? And I have a feeling that Europe is losing ground. Maybe I am wrong. What is your feeling? What do you believe?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to join you and to talk about these big topics that you outline. All these challenges and changes and fires and wars that are erupting all around us. A lot of uncertainties, including the US elections that you mentioned. And in the middle of all this comes the question, indeed, what can Europe do? What should Europe do? The word that springs to mind when I think about all this is that we are under tremendous pressure, the word pressure. I think Europe has increasingly difficulties to respond effectively to all these challenges. We are losing ground, not just economically, when it comes to competition with emerging powers and what have you, China, US, but also geopolitically, we are losing ground. We find it increasingly difficult to have the impact on the strategic environment that we all grapple with, when it comes to the war in Ukraine, when it comes to the war in Gaza, when it comes to the Balkans, when it comes to the Sahel and all sorts of other wars and crises all around us. So I think the task for Europe is really to shape up. We cannot accept, in my view, this trend on which we are of steady decline, of shrinking our role in the world because we're connected to the world. The impact that all these crises have on us is very serious. You feel it in all sorts of ways. So I think that the task is to shape up, and now that we are going to have a new EU leadership in the European Union, there's new presidents, there's a new high representative. I mean, the page is turning. There's a new moment on the political cycle of Europe. Now is the moment to discuss how we can do things differently and how we can do things better before the concrete sets again. So this is the task before us immediately now.
But we see now that the EU is even having a little bit of difficulty, if I dare say even more, with the EU Commission. There are problems there. We see delays. Do you think that she can be on top of things, on these threats, on these challenges that lie ahead? And also, if you could say, what are the biggest threats for EU right now?
Okay, I am a realist, so I see the problems are very serious, and we touched on and we described them a moment ago. But I'm not a fatalist. I don't think that this is impossible for the European Union to grapple with, provided we organize ourselves and we mobilize the political will to do so. Now, this is not easy. I don't want to sound naive, but I don't think it's impossible. It's unrealistic for us. I'm not so worried about the particular calendar of the European Commission and when exactly people will take office. Is it the 1st of November? Probably not. It's going to be the 1st of December? Probably yes. Look, that is not decisive. What matters more is, do you have the substantive policies to deal with the most important challenges? Now, you ask me, what are the most important ones? Well, for me, it begins with the war in Ukraine. There's nothing that is more consequential, I think, for European security overall, is the outcome of this. How will this war end? People ask. It's been going on for more than 2.5 years. We see, regrettably, that Russia is making steady gains again in the East. For me, the outcome of this war, how this ends, is of vital importance. Because in the end of the day, are we going to accept aggression pays, that invading a country with military force is something that we can live with? Or do you say, no, this is a fundamental importance to the European Union, to the Europeans collectively, and we don't want to live in a world where a bigger neighbor can just invade its neighbors, or that we don't want to feed? And we see this sort of pattern of sabotage by Russia, of interference through greater espionage, through GPS jamming as we saw over the Baltic Sea. So we see that we have a real problem with Russia. And this is not an imaginary problem. It's a problem that is getting more serious every day. So we have to find a real answer. It begins in Ukraine and giving Ukrainians the means to make sure that this war ends well for them. And the military means, including air defense, you know very well, you see the Russians destroying the electricity capacity of an entire country. You cannot have a country without electricity. And we do have air defense systems. Even we Europeans, not just we with the Americans, but as Europeans, we could give greater air defense systems so that the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian economy is better protected against the onslaught from Russia. Just a word on Russia. But it doesn't end there. There's a war in the Middle East, which, particularly if you're sitting in Greece, I imagine, you feel very, very closely. You have a big risk of a wider regional conflict between also Iran, proxies, Lebanon unstable. So this is a part of the world that is very fragile, that is experiencing enormous amount of tension, and where Europe, let's face it, we have been quite absent.
Yes, it's absent, I think, from the Middle East, from
absolutely,
the northern.
It's absent.
Yeah.
You're right. I mean, but why are we absent? Because let's be honest, we are quite divided as European countries on this, on how you assess let's say, the relative responsibilities for the different actions. Is it principally Israel? Is it principally Hamas? How to find this balance? And if you're absent, if you're divided, you're absent. The EU as such is not capable of changing let's say, the strategic calculus of the Israeli government, but neither of Hamas. And so we are reduced, and I regret this enormously, but we are reduced to more of people who give comments, people who give humanitarian aid to the extent that it's able to reach the people in Gaza, but not in a strategic political manner. We're not. In Ukraine is a little bit different. We have all sorts of problems in Ukraine too, but we're not as divided as we are on Ukraine, as we are clearly over the Israel-Hamas war. But I think it's very important for Europe. Then we have the Balkans. You have some countries advancing towards the European Union, and also other countries where that is not the case. We have growing tensions between Serbia and Kosovo. The picture in the Balkans is quite challenging as well, and this is European homework. You can look maybe to the Americans on what they do in Ukraine, or what you would like them to do differently on Israel and Gaza, but principally the responsibility for the Balkans rests on us Europeans. So these are already three things that I think the EU will have to take care of. Then there are bigger relationships on China. We can talk about everything later on. But let's start with the neighborhood. This is where EU security is most directly threatened. And at the moment, what we put on the table as policies is not in line with the challenge. I don't think so.
Now, we see that Germany has problems. France has also problems. Do you think that Europe can face the challenges without a very, very strong Franco-German axis?
A very good question. Listen, you say France has problems, Germany has problems. I could add, I'm from the Netherlands myself. We have challenges domestically. I think the common theme, whole Western world, is transition, fragmentation and transition. There are difficulties finding a government here in France. There's a US election going on. There's a transition in Brussels. We mentioned it a moment ago. Very unstable governments in a number of EU countries, not only France and Germany. Yeah? So all European leaders, they sit at the table of the European Council, and they feel, let's say, not in a situation of self-confidence and solidity, but with a degree of fragility. And this, what does it lead to? It leads to everybody sticking to their position, sticking to the red line, sticking to the classic position that this country or that country has always defended. And you know very well, our historical sensitivities. This country is more leaning in this direction, that country is more in that direction. But the magic of the European Union was always to try to somehow take care of these different national perspectives, these historical views, and somehow blend it into a European position, a European plan, a European action. But that machine is now struggling enormously because domestically our politics are complicated everywhere. They're complicated everywhere. And maybe in Greece it's better, but you tell me. Let's say
no, it's not better.
I look at the macro picture and I see trouble everywhere. It's very difficult to find stable majorities behind. The United Kingdom is an exception. You know, they go a little bit, let's say, counter-cyclical. The mega trend is towards fragmentation, instability, governments come and go. In the UK, they have now a very stable government. But they're the only ones that I see.
So, and in that environment, what will happen if Donald Trump gets elected in the US? How more difficult things are going to be?
Probably everything that we've discussed up until now, it's hard to see which, if anything, of these things will get easier with a Trump victory. Probably all these things will get even more hard. Domestically, I think the divisions among European countries will become greater. And there are also governments in Europe today who are looking forward to a Trump presidency. Maybe there are not so many, but there are. I think maybe one or two.
In Europe also?
In Europe also. I think inside Europe also, yes. I think there are. The majority not, I guess. I think the majority, and there are opinion polls that point out, the majority of Europeans would not probably be thrilled and excited about the Trump presidency. No, but in all seriousness, we know often people talk about Trump will do this and Trump will do that. I think the most important thing you can say about Trump is the degree of unpredictability, because the man doesn't always have a very clearly coherent, articulated set of ideologically based positions. There's a lot of also, jockeying for positions among his advisors and so on and so forth. Having said that caveat, and it's an important one, still, I think there are some clear orientations that would emerge from a Trump presidency, and you know what they are. It's a much more unilateral approach to international affairs, a much more transactional approach. Sometimes people use the word isolationism to describe Trump. I don't think, for me, that captures the essence. I think for me, it's more a deal-making, transactional. You give me this, I give you that. If you don't do this, I will punish you with that. It's a sort of a transactional approach to international life. We hear what he says about Ukraine. We hear what he says about NATO, about the European Union, and we are taking advantage of America. And, we hear possibilities around trade tariffs being introduced, 10%, maybe more. We hear about a much more qualified and reduced commitment to European security. We hear about certain, attitudes to climate change, which of course is very important for the European Union. You'll see a sort of an acceleration of fossil fuel in industrial policy in the United States, when we believe the world has to go forward and accelerate on the renewables and the green transition. So, I've mentioned 5 or 6 topics where I think things will become more complicated.
Regarding Turkey, Greece has its own problems with Turkey. We know that for many, many years. And now we are in a better point. We are discussing, but how do you see EU relations with Turkey evolving?
A little bit better as well, I think. And probably the fact that bilateral relations between Greece and Turkey have improved a little bit is also feeding into slightly better EU-Turkey relations overall. Everybody, I think, has their views on the accession track. Whether you think that will have a lot of progress to be made in the short term is questionable. But we all know that we are very close and very important partners for both, for EU for Turkey and Turkey for EU. I think we can make progress on the customs union. This is feasible. I think we can certainly also improve our cooperation with Turkey in all these regional crises. The Turks have very important roles to play in all these zones of chaos and conflicts surrounding us, and the focus in the Middle East, in the Balkans, in North Africa, wider Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, even in the Indo-Pacific. Turkey plays an important role on many, many fields. has built up its assets and its footprint around the world. It does a lot of drone diplomacy. It does a lot of business diplomacy. Turkish, let's say, soft power, also through television programming, is quite influential in many parts. So I think we see a Turkey that is spreading its wings, that has a growing international footprint and influence. And I see also a greater desire on the European Union side to open a slightly new chapter, maybe a bit less focused as such on the accession track, but maybe building a wider relationship, strategic relationship. Doesn't mean stopping accession. They don't want to stop. We don't want to stop. But let's say fleshing it out in a more balanced, strategically balanced way. And I see a lot of reasons for both, not only for us, but also for Turkey to do that.
And a question about two other countries that are very strong and are getting even stronger. And I talk about China, and I talk also about India. European Union had its good moments with China, and it's better and bad moments. Where do you think we are today regarding our relations with Beijing? Are we united?
Well, that's the eternal question you can ask about any country, any region, any topic. Are we united? Are we united enough? I think we have become more united on China over the years. I've dealt with China policy in the European structures when I was working there. And I have seen over the years that there is a bit more convergence on China. And this sort of, we had this triptych that we formulated, saying that China is both a partner for some topics, climate change, international health cooperation, terrorism. It's also a competitor, including an economic competitor, but sometimes also a political competitor. And it is thirdly a systemic rival, because it represents a very different political system than our democratic one. So this triptych of seeing China as all these things at the same time, rather than trying to say China is one thing and only one, it's only a competitor, or it's only a partner, or it's only a... No. This triptych, I think, has helped this European convergence to take shape in the last few years. It's of course true that the relative weight of these three pillars is changing, because China is changing, we are probably also changing, but China is changing probably faster than we are changing in the direction of greater centralization of power around Xi Jinping, a greater degree of nationalism, that you can see also how China positions itself in the region. You see a more hard-nosed approach emerging on its diplomacy, how it presents itself to the rest of the world. So let's say the competitor rival part of the triptych is gaining in prominence, I would say, gaining in relative weight. But we will be crazy to give up on the partner element and to say China is only a systemic rival or only a strategic competitor, as is the case in Washington. Washington, basically, they disagree about everything in the world, Democrats and Republicans, but they agree that China is a strategic competitor of the United States, and that's the framework that they adopt. So you see, in Europe, we see it a little bit different than the Americans from that perspective. But yes, you talked about unity. Of course, unity has to be demonstrated in practice, and it's not unheard of for the Chinese also to play a little bit divide and rule, to be nice to one guy and a bit less nice to somebody else, to this member state or that member state. And that is always a danger. That is always a danger in the European Union. And I will always beat the drum of the importance to invest in unity, not just say, oh, we should be united, we should be united. Of course, we should be united. But what are you willing to do to make sure that we remain united? What are you need to invest in something. It will not happen just by declaring that it is important. All of us, all 27 governments, all of us, we have to invest in this unity. And that means probably those that are very critical of China need to also allow for the space of partnership to flourish. And those that have been more closer to China or more open or a bit softer on China, if you want to use that term, they have to also realize that there is a real problem also with China on economic reciprocity, on some security actions that China engages also inside the European Union even, but also in other parts of the world that are important to us. And of course, last point, it's very important that we keep watching closely what China does in its support of high-tech goods to Russia, because essentially China is supporting the Kremlin's campaign to destroy Ukraine, including economic support, high-tech products, dual-use products coming from China. And this is a huge problem. This is a huge problem.
And what about India?
Look, India, I think I've had the pleasure of working a little bit on Asian matters in the EUISS years ago, so I followed that too. A huge growth in EU-India relations. In a way, it started a little bit with Brexit, because historically, let's say the UK was very much the entry point for the Indians into the European sphere, and then Brexit happened, and they realized, well, we need to deal with this European Union thing, and also with key member states. So we started to grow. We started to also go a little bit beyond a very trade-focused approach to India, and trying to build a much more rounded. So we started to work on digital and cyber issues, maritime security, very important for the Indians, very important for us. We work together on the Indian Ocean. So I see this as a fast-growing relationship. Maybe also a little bit to diversify away from heavy focus on China. And the demographics of India are much better than the demographics of China. China has peaked demographically. India is still growing. It's a noisy democracy, India. There are also concerns about sometimes the behavior of the BJP government. This is understandable and part of the dialogue. But no, I think it's a relationship that is still, let's say, below potential. I think there's a lot of work that we can still do together. It's not always easy to translate, let's say, the common will that exists on both sides into tangible progress, because it's not so easy in the Indian system to translate ideas into actual change. We ourselves are complicated, as you know very well. We're 27, and you have the commission, and you have this and so. We ourselves have our difficulties. But I think on both sides, there is this feeling in the air that EU-India have room to grow. I really believe so. And I think this will be, again, one of the priorities probably for the new commission. We have to get the trade deal done. Just get it done. Get it done will be my advice. It will maybe be less ambitious than Europe may like, or it may not always address all the priorities that the Indians have, but it's important to signal also to the world, to the Americans, to the Chinese, to the other Asian powers, that EU and India, we want to go. We want to go. Then there's connectivity. There's a whole agenda that writes itself. Let's implement that.
Well, in all our discussion, it all comes again for the EU that we agree that there is unanimity. Are you in favor of not having the veto power anymore?
I am.
You think that yes, that would push EU forward?
I do, and I can tell you, I've changed a little bit my mind on this. When I started dealing with this business 25 years ago, I wasn't in favor of this, because I was always of the view it's very sensitive foreign policy, particularly smaller countries who would like to have a certain protection of their core national interests. They're sort of scared a bit to be bulldozered by the French and the Germans, and you need, let's say, the buy-in of everybody to be credible. Actually. But I've started to change my mind a little bit over the years, because I saw the veto is being used more and more often, earlier in the policy process, on more and more issues, sometimes the issues that are not linked at all to the national interest of the member state, but just to build up, let's say, negotiating leverage on other files. As they say, I mean, it used to be a nuclear weapon, and now it's like a conventional weapon. It is used a lot, and it paralyzes us. You know very well what's now the case with the support for Ukraine, where we're blocked. And this is also spreading, because countries see, if you do it and you get away with it, but then I can also do it, I can also do it. And so the cancer is spreading in the system. And the only way to get out of it is to create incentives for people not to use it as a conventional weapon. I think there should be, like say, a two-stage approach. We should have more decisions by not regular majority voting, but you should be able to outvote single country vetoes, or one or two countries should not be able to block 25 others. You can have a sort of an emergency break in the case of vital national interest, but now it's used across the system almost. And I say also this, and it's about the final point, I am a believer in enlargement. I really think we should re-dynamize, re-accelerate, revitalize the enlargement agenda. You know very well the Ukraine issue has put it back on, but I don't think it's limited to Ukraine and Moldova. I think it should also apply to the Balkans. But then I do warn, we have a union of 27 that doesn't work as well as it should. If you're going to expand this union to 35 or even more, what doesn't work at 27 will not work better at 35. This makes no sense. So we have to get an agreement on this. Now, you know very well what I'm saying is impossible politically, because in order to change unanimity, you need unanimity, and the countries that oppose it will be very reluctant to give it up. So the only moment that I can see to go to the Gordian knot is at the moment of enlargement. And then when the next enlargement will happen, I think we should really do it in parallel. Say yes to enlargement, yes, but then yes also to abolishing the unanimity requirement in foreign policy.
Steven, thank you so much. Thank you very much for this discussion.
It was a pleasure, Odin. Thank you very much.